Good evening and welcome everybody. I want to welcome both this great overflow crowd that we have with us this evening, and there are also a number of people at home who are taking this live online and through our live streaming program. So we're delighted to have you all with us, particularly on such an auspicious spring-like evening, and you've chosen to be here with us in this room, and we're very appreciative of that. This is the first Askwith Forum of the semester, and as you will know, Askwith Forums are our effort on behalf of the School of Education to involve the community broadly in our discussions, not only our internal community at the School of Education, but here in Boston and Cambridge and throughout Massachusetts, and then online throughout the world. It's also part of our Fulfilling the Promise of Diversity series here at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, so we're delighted to have you with us for this conversation. My job is to tee us up this evening, and we're going to have then, of course, remarks from Bob Putnam, and then we have a distinguished panel to discuss those remarks, and then we're going to open it up to you, and there are microphones in the audience when the time comes that we'll ask you to approach those microphones and participate in the conversation. In his book, Our Kids, The American Dream in Crisis, Robert Putnam has written deeply and poignantly about a subject of which we in schools of education are acutely aware: the changing social, economic, cultural, and demographic environment surrounding our schools. He has pointed with alarm to phenomena like rapidly diminishing social mobility, the changing nature of neighborhoods and communities, increasing economic class segregation, the huge differences in social capital available to different children, and the enormous impact of these changes on not only the learning, but mentoring and employment opportunities that children enjoy, but on their very prospects for success in life more generally. And by the way, not only has Robert been effective at writing about these topics as a scholar and as an observer, translating his observations into accessible language so as to catch widespread public attention, but he's managed to push this topic of diminishing social mobility onto the national and international political stage at the very highest levels through his deft and very impressive advocacy work. The subject of our evening is the growing gaps Putnam describes and what we can do about them in our schools and communities. Too often we ignore these changes and their impacts, seemingly pretending that if we just continue to do what we've been doing, or at a minimum, continue to try to improve existing institutions, for example, optimizing schools as we know them, we will be able to successfully overcome these unprecedented challenges. The evidence suggests otherwise. For over the past couple of decades, when we've invested deeply in education reform, in time and energy and in treasure, we still have an iron law correlation between socioeconomic status and educational achievement and attainment. We can now see that school reform alone, at least as we know it, won't do the job of breaking the correlation or the connection between demographics and destiny. But if school reform itself needs to be reconsidered, and if we need to move beyond the walls of schools to think about community, economics, and child development, more broadly, uplifting the lives of disadvantaged children and increasing the capacities of our families and communities, what should we be thinking and doing? Well, Robert Putnam, as well as our panelists, are here tonight to help guide and inform us as we consider these challenges. Let me briefly introduce them. Our first panelist is Meira Levinson, who is a professor of education here at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. She fosters civic education scholarship at Harvard as the co-convener of HGSE's Civic and Moral Education Initiative. She is a normative political philosopher who writes about civic education, multiculturalism, youth empowerment, and educational ethics. She has also taught in the Atlanta and Boston public schools for an accumulated total of 8 years. Her most recent books include the co-edited Making Civics Count and No Citizen Left Behind. She received a 2014 Guggenheim Fellowship to support her newest project on justice in schools. In this work, she combines philosophical analysis and school-based case studies to illuminate the complex dimensions of evaluating, achieving, and teaching justice in schools. Levinson earned a Doctor of Philosophy and Political Theory from Newfield College, Oxford, and her BA in Philosophy from Yale. Roland Fryer is our second panelist. He is the Henry Lee Professor of Economics at Harvard University and a Professor of Education here at HGSE and Faculty Director of the Education Innovation Laboratory, the Ed Labs. Fryer's research combines economic theory, empirical evidence, and randomized experiments to help design more effective government policies. His work on education, inequality, and race has been widely cited in media outlets and congressional testimony. Fryer was awarded a MacArthur Genius Fellowship and the John Bates Clark Medal given by the American Economic Association to the best American economist under the age of 40. Among other honors, he is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and a recipient of the Calvo Armengol Prize and the Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers. At age 30, he became the youngest African American to receive tenure at Harvard University. His current research focuses in on education reform, social interactions, and police use of force. He earned his PhD from Penn State and a BA magna cum laude from the University of Texas, Arlington, both in economics. And finally, Robert D. Putnam, who is the Peter and Isabel Malkin Professor of Public Policy at Harvard University. He is a member of the National Academy of Sciences and the British Academy and the past president of the American Political Association. He's received numerous scholarly honors, including the Skite Prize, the most prestigious global award in political science, and the National Humanities Medal, the nation's highest honor for contribution to the humanities. He's written 14 books, translated into more than 20 languages, including Bowling Alone and Making Democracy Work, both among the most cited publications in the social sciences in the last half-century. Raised in a small town in the Midwest and educated at Swarthmore, Oxford, and Yale, Putnam has served as Dean of the Kennedy School of Government. So it's with great pleasure that I ask you to join me in welcoming to the podium Robert Putnam.
Thank you very much. I apologize for that. I apologize for the fact that I've got a bad cold, despite the spring-like weather that we had today. And I'm very grateful to you, all of you, for coming out this evening. I'm grateful to the Graduate School of Education for hosting this event. I've been looking forward to it for some time because I'm eager to have a conversation with people who are professionally in the field of education about the issues that I'm raising. And I'm particularly pleased to have these two, well, of course, to have it chaired by Paul, but to have these two commentators. I'm going to tell you how old I am by the fact that I knew both of these commentators when they had not yet finished their graduate education, I believe. And at the time I thought, wow, those are really smart. Separately I met them. Those are really smart people. And it's a mark of how old aging that you find that the really smart young people you encounter then turn out to be really smart as professionals and in their careers. So I'm honored. I wanted to say that before we hear what they have to say about my book, because I wanted you to know that I'm on record as saying they're really extremely talented scholars. I want to talk to you this evening about what I think is a really fundamental problem facing America. That is a growing opportunity gap between rich kids and poor kids in America. I want to begin at the 30,000-foot level and describe some big changes that have happened in America over the course of my lifetime, over the last, even over the last half century, say, in America. And then I want to come down and ask about what the implications of all those larger changes are for our kids. Now, lots of good things have happened in America over the last 50 years. We have, we're a somewhat less racist society than we were in the 1950s. We're a significantly less sexist society than we were in the 1950s. So big progress along those two dimensions. We're I don't mean adequate progress, but we have made measurable progress in those two areas. Niftier phones than we had before. So a lot of good things have happened, but on I want to focus on a couple of changes that have happened over the last 50 years that are, I think, not healthful for our society. The first big change that I want to describe is the growing income gap in America. That is the distribution of income between rich folks and poor folks. If we imagine lining up all Americans here along the room with the richest Americans over here, this is going to be the rich end of the room for this evening's purposes. Far on the wall is Bill Gates and Warren Buffett and so on. And then here we have people sort of in the middle, and then down there at the far end are the most impoverished Americans, least educated Americans. And what's happened over the last 30 years, basically, is that the folks over there have done really, really well, and people from about here down to the bottom of the income distribution haven't really had a raise in the last 30 years. So there's been a growing income gap in America. Historically, Americans have been less concerned about income equality than people in other countries because we've kind of assumed that, well, if everybody gets on the ladder at the same point, and some people climb higher or faster, that's just because they worked harder at it or they're better climbers. On the assumption that everybody's getting on the ladder at the same point. But compared to other countries, we have historically cared a lot more about that assumption. Are we all getting on the ladder at the same point? And that issue of equality, not of outcome, but equality of opportunity, is what we're going to be talking about this evening. So the first big change that's occurred is the growing income gap, the growing economic inequality. A lot of talk about that, of course. We all know it's a central issue in political discussions now. Second big change that's occurred over this period is much less widely discussed, but is probably more important, and that is that America has become a more segregated society in social class terms over the last 30 or 40 years. Increasingly, Americans either are living in relatively affluent, well-educated enclaves, or living in relatively impoverished, less educated enclaves, and fewer of us are living in mixed income or moderate education level communities. So increasingly, where we live is increasingly determined by what our education and income level is. Of course, there's always been some class segregation in terms of residences, but that's increased. At the same time that residential segregation by religion is way down, and residential segregation by race is slightly down over this period, but residential segregation by class is up over this period. And it's not just where we live, it also affects who our kids go to school with, because increasingly kids in America are either going to school with other rich kids. If they're rich, they're going to school with other rich kids, or if they're not so rich, their parents are not rich or not so well-educated, they're going to school with other poor kids. And decreasingly, American school kids in schools where they encounter people from other social class backgrounds. That has a lot of effects that we can get to later, maybe. It even shows up in terms of whom we marry. Actually, intermarriage turns out to be a really interesting sociological measure, mostly because we tend not to marry people that we haven't met. So we see nationally rates of interfaith marriages are rising because increasingly kids in their teens and 20s and 30s are meeting people of other religions. The decline of religious schools in America has had that's been one of the effects it's had. And increasingly, we have interracial marriage is much more common than it used to be in America, because increasingly people are encountering people in their marriageable age are encountering people of other races, and sometimes sparks fly. And conversely, the fact that interclass marriage is declining pretty sharply is a silent indicator of the fact that increasingly people are going to school with and encountering only people who come from similar class backgrounds. So in this and in many other ways, the second big trend I wanted to talk about is not the economic polarization, but the sociological polarization in which we are becoming, I don't want to exaggerate this, but we're moving in a direction of living in two separate Americas, one that's pretty affluent and well-educated and one that isn't. And then a third big trend that maybe we can talk about more later is the collapse of social and community ties in what we used to call the working class. And this shows up in a lot of different ways. It shows up for example, in the fraction of kids from different class backgrounds who are growing up within a single-parent household. A generation ago, or 2 generations ago, there was a little bit of a class difference in terms of the likelihood of, if you're a kid, your likelihood of having only a single parent at home, depending upon the education or income of your parents. But that gap has dramatically increased because the fraction of single-parent families among college-educated Americans, that's the upper third, there's been a decline in single-parent homes, whereas among the lower third of American society, basically high school-educated Americans, there's been a dramatic increase in the rate of single-parent families, rising from something like probably 18% of all kids in working-class homes living in a single-parent family 50 years ago to now about 70% of all kids in working-class homes are living in single-parent families. I want to make clear, I'm not making a moral point about that, and I'm not blaming the mothers involved. Usually, in fact, if there's any blame to go around, it's the absent fathers. But the fact is that it's just harder to raise kids if there's only one parent at home. And that is a single example of the fact that the social fabric, which used to be an important part of the reality of lives of kids in poor homes, that social fabric has seriously deteriorated over this period. Now, in the book, I have a whole lot of graphs and charts that attempt to answer the question, so what? What's the consequence of these big changes in America? The growing income gap, the growing social segregation, the collapse of community and family in the working class communities, in working class areas. What's the implication of all that for kids? And there's in the book there's a lot of data because I'm a data person. But I want to just pause now and just tell you a story, because I think the stories sometimes are better than data at conveying what's going on. So I want to tell you, if you'll bear with me a minute, about the history of a small town in the middle of America. It's a town called Port Clinton, Ohio. Port Clinton, Ohio is a little town on Lake Erie, up on the northern part of Ohio. And I'm going to be telling you about Port Clinton in the 1950s and then about Port Clinton now. I know a fair amount about Port Clinton in the 1950s, a town of then and now, town of about 5,000 people, mostly white, some non-white kids in town. I know a great deal about it because that's where I grew up. It's my hometown, so I'm telling you about my hometown. So when I grew up in Port Clinton in the 1950s, nobody very rich in town, nobody very poor, kind of Lake Wobegon on Lake Erie. The dads of most of my classmates worked as manual workers on the assembly line in the local small factories, or they were farmers, or they were fishermen on Lake Erie. The moms, or they were small businessmen like my dad. Our moms were almost all stay-at-home moms. And we were not very conscious of social class distinctions. We now know, and by the way, it was a pretty modest town. Of about 40% of the parents of my graduating class in 1959, 40% of the parents had not graduated from high school. So it was a pretty modest place. And we now know how this class of the Port Clinton High School class of 1959 has done. We have done amazingly well. 80% of us have done better than our parents. And the kids from the wrong side of the tracks, so to speak, have done just about as well as the kids from the right side of the tracks. The social class of one's parents it turns out to be very little predictive of how well the kids in the class of 59 have done. That's not because we were particularly bright. I think it's because of where we happened to be living and the time we were growing up. So I graduated from Port Clinton High School in 1959. I went off to college, and I got a fellowship from a local company, and went to college at Swarthmore. Met a young woman there, really cute, smart young woman. We've been hanging out together for the last 55 years, so far so good. We had 2 kids. Both of our kids went to Harvard. And we have 7 terrific grandchildren. I want to show you the pictures of my 7 grandchildren. Miriam is one of our grandchildren, is a senior this year at one of America's best universities. Actually, all of our grandchildren either are now in one of America's best universities or they're on their way there. And Miriam is going to be graduating next spring. She's majoring in French literature. She spent last summer in France studying, or so she told us, studying French architecture and French cuisine. And we're really proud of her. She's a hardworking kid. Meanwhile, back in Port Clinton, there was another guy. I didn't actually know him because he was a few years behind me, but he played football just as I played football. I'm going to call him Joe. Joe's not his real name, but he's a real guy. Joe left Port Clinton High School, graduated, decided not to go to college, but took a job in the local economy, manual worker in the local economy, did really well. For much of his career, his annual salary was higher than my annual salary. He got married, and he had 2 kids. And his kids both graduated from Port Clinton High School. And then the bottom fell out of the Port Clinton economy and really of the working class economy across America. And so Joe's kids have never held a steady job. My kids both graduated from Harvard and have professional degrees and have been very successful professionally. Joe's kids have never held a steady job. And Joe's kids have never gotten married. But that has not stopped them from having kids. And one of Joe's kids, who's exactly the same, one of Joe's grandchildren, I mean, who's exactly the same age as my Miriam, is a young woman that we're calling Mary Sue. Mary Sue is not her real name, but sadly, Mary Sue is very definitely a real person. I want to just read to you from the field notes of Jen Silva, who was the ethnographer, unbelievably talented young ethnographer on our research team. Her field notes of her interview with Mary Sue. Mary Sue tells a harrowing tale of loneliness, distrust, and isolation. Her parents split up when she was 5, and her mother turned to stripping and left her alone and hungry for days. Her dad hooked up with another woman who hit her, refused to feed her, and confined Mary Sue to her room with baby gates. Caught trafficking marijuana at 16, Mary Sue spent several months in a juvenile detention center, failed out of high school, and got a diploma online. Her experiences have left her with a deep-seated mistrust of anyone and everyone, embodied in the scars on her arms where a boyfriend burned her in the middle of the night, just before we met her. Mary Sue wistfully recalls her stillborn baby, born when she was 13. Since breaking up with the baby's dad, who left her for someone else, and with a second fiancé, who cheated on her after his release from prison, Mary Sue is currently dating an older man with 2 infants, born 2 months apart, to 2 other mothers. And to Mary Sue, this feels like the best she can hope for. It's actually hard for me to tell you the story of Mary Sue. Mary Sue is exactly the same age as my Miriam. And the story is worse. It gets worse the more you know about the story. Mary Sue's new older boyfriend has told her he's found a job for her. He's going to get her a job as a model in Toledo. It gets worse. Mary Sue recently posted on Facebook that she's figured out her problem. Her problem is that nobody loves her. That's actually probably true. And she's figured out how to solve that problem. Mary Sue's going to have a baby. And if you think Mary Sue's in a pickle, think about Mary Sue's baby. Mary Sue and Miriam are both grandchildren of Port Clinton in the 1950s. They're both attractive young women. But my Miriam made one really smart decision. She chose college-educated parents in a period in which the American economy was favoring people with a college degree. And Mary Sue made only one decision, bad decision, I mean. She chose high school educated parents in a period in which working class Americans were having a hard time economically. And you understand, I think I'm really proud of Miriam. I don't think there's anything wrong about the prospects she has. But she and Mary Sue are living in different universes. And that contrast illustrates the contrast that is then documented in the innumerable tables and graphs and charts in the book. Now, I haven't even told you the rest of Port Clinton. I'm going to be very brief about this because I know we have other things to talk about than Port Clinton. But Port Clinton has, the downtown of Port Clinton is a basket case now. Looks like you've seen pictures of these towns that are kind of Rust Belt towns. But with broken windows and boarded up stores and so on. But Port Clinton has one advantage. It has a great site on Lake Erie. And when I was growing up, the site along Lake Erie was mostly fishing camps and fruit orchards and so on. But now, along Port Clinton's shore, about 20 miles long and about 150 yards deep, is one long gated community of million-dollar mansions. And you can drive down a road in Port Clinton, East Harbor Road. I'd be glad to take you there and show you. And if you look to the left, the child poverty rate in that census tract along the lake is 0. There are no poor kids in that census tract. But if you looked at the other side of the road, at the dilapidated double wides and the shacks, which is where Mary Sue lives, the child poverty rate is 50%, 50%. And this in a tiny little town. If I told you that there were great social cleavages in New York, Manhattan or LA or Chicago, you wouldn't be surprised maybe. But to see that same economic and social polarization and the same pathologies in a little town in the middle of America conveys how dramatically the world has changed, actually. Our world has changed over these last 50 years as it affects our kids. And we've done ethnographic research like this all over America. We've done exactly the same kind of studies that we did in Port Clinton. We've done in Orange County and in Atlanta and in Duluth, Minnesota, and in the Boston area, and in Bend, Oregon, all over the country. And there are Mary Sues and Miriams everywhere in America. There are Mary Sues and Miriams within 2 or 3 miles of us right now. And that gap is the result of a series of pretty dramatic changes in the experiences and opportunities available to kids in America, depending upon their parents' social class. So now the statistics that back this up, I'm going to summarize for you very briefly, and you're just going to have to, if you want to look up the numbers and make sure that I've done it right and so on, you can look at the book, but I'm going to summarize for you very quickly in a series of scissors graphs in which the horizontal axis is time. We have 1960 or 70 over here, and 2015 or something like that over here. And the vertical axis is going to be some good thing about child development, like the amount of money spent on children for summer camp and so on. And we're going to look at this. The graph's going to look like this because, in general, in these graphs, the upper part of the scissors graph is going to be trends in that outcome or that characteristic of child development for kids coming from college-educated homes in America. And the bottom line is going to be the same trend for kids coming from high school-educated homes in America. Now, I want to emphasize that because it's not just, I'm talking about class differences. I use that indicator, college-educated or high school-educated, just because conveniently it turns out that the upper third of American society are constituted by people who have a college degree, and the lower third are people who haven't gotten past high school. And I'm just going to call those people rich and those people poor, but all I mean by that is the upper third or lower third. Can I see the hands of all the people in the room who have a college degree, please? So every time I say rich, I mean you. And we're comparing you to people just like you who don't have the benefit, who didn't get past high school. And I'm talking about social class, and a really important question to be asked, but I'm not going to ask it right now, is what's the connection between class divergences and racial disparities? There are important purely racial disparities in America that are worth spending a lot of time talking about, and it's worth talking about how these class differences that I'm talking about overlap with or reinforce racial differences for sure. I'm going to be talking only about class because I want to focus on these class differences. And most of the growing gaps that I'm going to be talking about are concentrated among white kids. So what I want to say is what I'm talking about is not just a racial issue, although it is, of course, still a racial issue because we know that there's lots of racial injustice in America, too. But the pictures I'm going to be describing to you, these scissors graphs, are measured in terms of parental social class. So there's a graph like that for the amount of time parents spend with their kids, what we call good night moon time. That is the amount of time parents spend reading to their kids and playing pat a cake with them and so on. And that's gone, actually that graph looks like this because it's going up both for working class kids and for upper middle class kids, but it's going up much more rapidly among upper middle class kids so that the Miriams of the world, Miriam's my granddaughter, the Miriams of America are now getting about 45 minutes a day more good night moon time than the Mary Sues of America. And if you think that's who cares about good night moon time, that's because you haven't yet had a chance to read the most recent research on early childhood, infant brain development. Because what we know, and research done actually here in this university and across the country, makes clear that the human brain does not develop like a mushroom in a dark womb, slowly all by itself growing. The human brain grows through social interaction, what the pediatric neurologists call serve and response. So the baby issues some signal like "woo," and some nearby adult says, "Oh, isn't that sweet?" And then the baby issues another signal saying "goo goo goo goo," and the nearby adult says, "Oh, looks just like your mother." And we now know that verbal interaction, that verbal ping pong, is contributing to the development of the brain. And so when Mary Sue was in the closet locked in her room with the baby gate, and my Miriam was getting having lots of stories read to her. That was a really big deal in terms of the development of these two children. Similar kinds of gaps, not just in good night moon time, but also in terms of the amount of time, the amount of money we spend on our kids for what's called enrichment, that is piano lessons and summer camp and computer games and all that. Huge growing gap in that. So now people coming from affluent backgrounds, their parents per child spend about $7,000 a year on them for piano lessons and summer camp and so on, as compared to about $700 a year for poor kids. It didn't used to be anything like that large. Similar kinds of gaps in test scores. A graduate of this institution, Sean Reardon, out at Stanford now, has shown a growing test score gap. Test scores rising for kids coming from upper middle class homes, college educated homes, and not rising for kids coming from poor backgrounds. Similar kinds of another kind of test score, gap like that, growing gap in extracurricular activities. Taking part in band and chorus and football. And sometimes people tease me about the fact that I'm talking about trying to make the case that America is going to hell in a handbasket because we don't have enough high school football. But what we now know about extracurricular activities is that they actually do create and inculcate what are called soft skills. That is teamwork and grit, what my mom used to call stick-to-itiveness, and determination. And those skills that kids learn in band or chorus, and because you learn stick-to-itiveness not just on the football field, but also in the practice room. All those extracurricular activities, indeed, extracurricular activities, do you know this? Extracurricular activities were invented for the purpose of creating an opportunity for all kids in the schools to have to develop soft skills. That's where extracurricular activities came from in America. God did not invent high school football. It was invented by high school reformers about 100 years ago. And for most of the 20th century, in Port Clinton and all over America, you got to play football or band or chorus. I got the good taxpayers of Port Clinton paid for a trombone for me and for 5 years of trombone lessons and for a conductor and for music and I played football, so they also paid for I was lousy, but they paid for my spikes and my pads and my helmet and the Friday night lights and the coach and so on, just because I was a kid. Everybody got that. But now, over the last 30 years, there's been a growing gap. Kids coming from affluent homes are still doing all those things, maybe even more, because their parents are also giving them private lessons. But there's a substantial drop in taking part in extracurricular activities among working class kids. And you ask why was that? And that's because there are many reasons, but the most important is pay to play. Now in Port Clinton, if you want to play football, if I want to go back in Port Clinton and play football now, my parents would have to pay, on average, about $1,600 a year for me to take part in sports or music or whatever. And if your annual income is $200,000, $1,600 is nothing. But if your annual income is $16,000, well, who in their right mind is going to spend 10% of their annual income on your kids playing sports? So what that means is we know that this will have an effect on these kids' lifetime income. A lot of other ways in which you can see a lot of other graphs like this. I'm going on a little long, and I don't want to bore you with these graphs, but there's a chart like that for taking part in going to church or being involved in religious organizations. I'm not worried about that because of the theology of it, but churches used to be one of the main places where somebody outside, some adult outside the immediate family of the kid was paying attention to the kid. And that is no longer true because there's this gap. Indeed, the most important here's the thing, the most important single generalization you can make about poor kids in America now is that they are alone. Mary Sue is alone. She can't trust her parents because there's disarray in the family. She can't trust the schools because she's likely to be in a lousy school. She can't trust her neighbors because she's living in a lousy neighborhood. She can't trust people at church because she's not at church. America's poor young people are alone and isolated, and they know it. And they are angry and unbelievably cynical. Mary Sue posted on Facebook just a couple of months ago, "Love hurts. Trust kills." Think what it means to grow up in a society in which you can't trust anybody. And one way to put that in context is to begin with the premise that all kids do dumb things. Rich kids, poor kids, black kids, white kids, brown kids, your kids, my kids, all kids do dumb things. They drink too much, or they get involved with drugs, or they make a mistaken romantic alliance, or they get in a fight with a teacher, or they back the car into the next door neighbor's garage, or whatever. When a kid coming from an affluent home does a dumb thing like that, instantly airbags inflate to protect the child from the consequences of those dumb decisions, make it a learning experience. If, God forbid, we should discover that Miriam is involved with drugs, the first thing I would do is find the best lawyer in town, and the second is to find the best rehab facility. And I'm not apologizing for that. It's what parents or grandparents do for their kids. But if Mary Sue or poor kid made exactly the same decision, no airbag. And that captures the way in which we have increasingly in America left kids alone. Now, I want to come to the conclusion. I guess it's clear why I think this is important. I think this is important partly as an economic reason, as an economic issue, because it's now really data in the book that shocked me. Suppose we compare two people in America today and ask what their likelihood is of completing college. A kid who has high test scores but comes from a poor background, or a kid who has low test scores and comes from a rich background. So it turns out that right now in America, smart poor kids are less likely to complete college than dumb rich kids. Challenged rich kids. And it's not like I'm upset about the fact that there are some rich kids going to school whose test scores are low. I am very upset about those really smart, certifiably test score smart, poor kids who are not getting the advantages of a college education just because of their parents' income. And by the way, I've been talking about that in terms of college access, but it's not actually mostly driven by college tuition. It's mostly driven by all of these other things much earlier on. Well, everything I've said here is a downer, but I want to close just quickly with an upper, because I think, actually, I'm pretty optimistic that we can fix this problem, but I want to tell you why. I want to say we can fix this problem, I think, because America has been here before. America has previously been in a situation very much like the situation we're in now. That is, very high and rapidly increasing rates of economic inequality. I'm talking about the 100 years ago, 110 years ago, the Gilded Age at the turn of the last century, around 1890, 1900. Great fortunes and lots of really very, very poor people. High rates of immigration, so lots of the poor people weren't like us. They were from some other race, as we said at the time. A period of great political corruption and great political alienation. A period in which the public philosophy was what was sometimes called social Darwinism. Social Darwinism was the philosophy that, I'm simplifying it a little bit, America would be better off if everyone was just selfish, and the devil take the hindmost. A period, in short, a lot like ours, a period in which there was these great gaps in society, and America seemed, heading downhill rapidly. And then, in a very short period of time, in about 10 or 15 years, America recognized the problem, in part as a result of books like a famous book called How the Other Half Lives, which simply described life in the slums of the Lower East Side, of Manhattan, meant to be read by the rich folks in the silk-stocking districts of the Upper East Side, saying, do you want to live in a society in which there are people living like that? I don't claim that Our Kids is going to have the same impact as that book did, but that's a genre in which Our Kids was written. I want to confront Americans, affluent Americans, educated Americans, with the reality of what's happening to poor kids in America. And it really is the final point. We did a lot of policy things that made a difference, that turned it around, and if we had more time, I'd show you the graphs, and we turned it around 1900, 1910. The single most important, or the best example of that is Americans invented the high school. Americans invented the high school around 1910. First time in the world that a community, or any community, said all kids in town are going to get a free 4 years comprehensive secondary education just because they're kids in this town. That's what the high school meant, and it was invented not in Cambridge and not in New York, not on one of the coasts. It was invented in small towns in the middle of America, in Nebraska and Kansas and Iowa and other places like that. And the local folks in town basically, here it was not an easy sell. If you're a reformer and you're in this little, East Elbow, Iowa, you had to say to the rich banker and the rich lawyer and the rich farmer in town, who had already paid for their kids to have a secondary education, and their kids were off now in Chicago making bucks, you had to say to them, you would be better off, we would all be better off if you would pay higher taxes so that all the kids in town could get the benefit of that secondary education. And it was a tough sell. But in these towns, at first, that idea did sell, and the idea was so successful that it spread very rapidly across the country, and it was the best public policy decision America has ever made, because it did two things simultaneously that economists tell us you can't usually do together. On the one hand, it so increased the productivity of the American labor force by giving a huge boost to the training of the American labor force that economic historians here over in the yard have shown that one decision, having free secondary education for everybody, a universal secondary education, accounts for most of American economic growth throughout the whole of the 20th century. Huge increase in our national productivity. So everybody was better off, including the rich farmers and bankers and businessmen. And at the same time, it leveled the playing field. And economists say you got to choose. You can either have equity or you can have efficiency. You can't have both. But it turns out that decision was terrific. And there are several quick lessons from that example. First of all, the breakthrough came Not in Washington. The breakthrough came in small towns and cities and states across America, and I think that's what's probably going to happen this time. Secondly, that decision it came out of America's own sense of our obligations to other people's kids. I am not saying, my bottom line here is not that we should become like Sweden. I'm saying we should just become like America. America's done this in the past. This is not un-American. This is core American, to worry about other people's kids. And that's why the book has the title it does. Because when I was growing up in Port Clinton in the 1950s, and my parents used the expression, our kids, they didn't mean, when they said our kids, they did not mean my sister Elaine and me. When they said, it would be nice if we had a swimming pool, we ought to invest some money if we could have a swimming pool. They were not talking about a swimming pool in our backyard. They were talking about paying everybody in town paying taxes so that all the kids could have a swimming pool. And they said that, and they paid those taxes even when my sister and I were long gone. The term our kids meant all the kids in town. But over the course of the last 30 or 40 years, in America, the meaning of the term our kids has shriveled. So now increasingly we're talking, when you hear people use the expression our kids, they're talking about their own biological kids. In Port Clinton, when I talk to people in Port Clinton, talk to people about Mary Sue, they say, well, I don't know, she's not my kid, she's somebody else's kid, let them worry about her. And that constriction of our sense of obligation for other people is costing us and will cost us heavily in the future. I haven't said very much about what we can do about this. I think there are things we can do. I haven't said very much about what the 21st century equivalent of the high school is. I've gone on too long already, and I know that the commentators are going to have a chance to say what they think the role of schools should be and what other factors need to be done. But I think, and this is what is meant to be optimistic, we have done this before. We just have to recognize that this is a problem and then get about the business of fixing it. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you so much, Bob. And you have certainly given us a lot to think about and a lot to talk about. By prior agreement, Roland, you're going to lead us off.
Okay, all right. I found that was awesome. I actually met Bob. I'm surprised you remember it. We met 16 years ago on the south side of Chicago. Right. And at that point, exactly. So at that point, I was so poor that I was partitioning the bologna sandwiches. Like you could have 2 for breakfast, 2 for lunch, 2 for dinner. And so they said, you asked. You said, would you like to go to dinner? I said, oh yeah. And we went to Piccolo Mondo on south side of Chicago. And your face when I ordered 3 entrees. But I was just hungry, brother. I was starving. It was very interesting to hear this. And, deeply saddened, like all of us, by the story of Mary Sue. But I have to say, there's a part of me that says, if you add a little police violence in that, Mary Sue's name will be Shakisha. Mm-hmm. We've heard this before. I realize that there's a fork, but the level differences between races and the economic gaps are still very, very similar. And, I am enormously optimistic that we can make progress. The difference, as you described, is not just going to college relative to not. It's having marketable skills. And in the 1980s, the price of skill went up just like that fork. And when you have differences in skill bundles, we would call it, as an economist, between 2 populations of people, and the price of those skills goes up, the differences that you see get magnified. So the story that you told is tragic. And frankly, I grew up as poor as dirt, and the kids I left behind, 8 out of 10 of my high school friends are either dead or in prison. I get it. The price of skills is higher than ever. So the question is, how do we actually help people get those skills? I was extraordinarily lucky. I grew up with a grandmother who cared a lot and that made sure that I obtained some measure of skills. When I first got to Harvard, I started this incentive program paying kids for this or that. It's because I couldn't do my grandmother's incentive program, which was get grades or else. IRB doesn't allow those types of things. But I think it's all about how do we actually embody poor children of any race with marketable skills, okay? And there are various ways to do that, but let me just describe one. Over the past 3 years, we went out and tried to understand what makes some schools good and other schools not so good when it comes to educating poor children. Because if you look at, for example, the distribution of charter schools, the average charter school is no better than the average public school. But and people don't like to talk about that, but whatever, let's do it. But there's a huge distribution, right? So there's schools on the right tail of that distribution that are phenomenal. They've got like 60-minute specials. You know, Jeff Canada is a national hero. He's Superman, apparently. And you've got schools on the left tail of that distribution that are terrible, that should be closed down. And we went into this trying to ask the question, what makes some of these schools really effective at educating kids and others not so effective? And I only got a few minutes, so I'm going to skip right to the point, like you did, and say we found 5 things that were correlated with how productive a school was. One was how much time they spent in school. So I think of it as the basic physics of education. If you're behind, you either need to go longer or ask the kids ahead of you, could you please take Thursday and Friday off? And then, I don't mind. See, I'm good with excellence and equity, but I really want that equity. And so that's more time. And then it was about human capital. It was extraordinarily important. How much focus they put on, and who were the teachers that were educating kids, and who were the leaders that were leading those teachers in the school. Third thing was how they used data to drive instruction. Data walls are a thing of the past. Right? Every time I go into a school, because I look like a 6'3" nerd, they're like, hey, you want to see our data wall? I'm like, okay. That wasn't effective. If you just correlate whether or not they have a data wall with, treatment effects of effectiveness, you get a big fat 0. However, if you were to say, well, how do they actually use that data to alter the scope and sequence or the pacing of instruction, those things are correlated with success. The fourth thing is good old-fashioned tutoring. Putting kids in small groups multiple times per week. And the fifth one really is about expectations. And the schools that we were in, 90% were poverty, 88% were female-headed households. The question, and what we really differentiated, was what they thought they could expect of the students when they crossed their threshold. Right? And these 5 factors, I know they don't sound like much. Right? When my grandmother it's almost 2 years since her death, and when she was still living, we would talk about research, and she really didn't understand this Harvard thing. You thought Port Clinton, Daytona Beach, Florida, is like the East Coast equivalent. And I remember telling her that I found these 5 things that explain 50% of the variance and why some charter schools do well and others don't do so well. And I told her my 5 things, because I was about to write this paper up. I was so proud of it. And she said, baby, they pay you for that shit. So we can take so what we did, I'll shut up. We took these 5 things, okay? These are all correlations, kind of like the correlations that Professor Putnam described. And at a high level, they can be very informative. But what we did was we took these 5 things and we actually put them into a randomized field trial in 20 schools in Houston. Regular old kids, no lottery, just basic stuff, the majority of them poor. And what we showed is that in 3 years, for the elementary school kids, for example, you can close the gap in math and cut it in half in reading. And for the secondary students, you need about 5 years. So these things can be done. We know how to give kids productive skills. Yes, it costs more. We know how to do it. And my frustration and Bob's frustration is, the truth is we just don't have the courage to get it done.
Great. Thank you for teeing that up. Meira?
So I'm torn because I like the optimistic upward trajectory of saying that we know how to do it, and I don't want to be a downer. But I want to push to say that what I think Bob describes in our kids is a vision of life in the United States that is so profound in part because it's so holistic. So Bob has a chapter on families, on communities, on schools, on religious organizations, civil society. It's an ecological picture of child rearing and child development and child learning. And it emphasizes that kids are learning in all of these places, and they're growing and they're being affected in all of these places. And I think it's important for us to remember that, say, what Roland is talking about, it has to be a both and. We can't stop with schools. That's one of the things that I love about Bob's book, is that he takes us into the lives of children and of families and of neighborhoods, and helps us think about what is it like to grow up. He describes, say, when their ethnographer was doing one interview with a father who asked to bring along his younger daughter so that she could meet somebody who had graduated from college. That reminded me of a student of mine who I taught in 8th grade in Dorchester some years ago, who we were getting together over the summer after she had graduated from 8th grade, and I kept suggesting like coffee shops, making it clear I was going to buy the coffee or the tea. This was not an economic issue, and she had a free tea pass, and she kept wanting to come to my house. And finally I said, fine, you can come to my house, right? But why? And she said, because I want to see the house with the white picket fence. I've never seen a house that somebody owned, and I want to see what that looks like, and I want to see like your family in the house. She was making sure, she kept trying to come on a weekend, and I couldn't figure that out either. And finally she just said to me, I want to see your kids in their own bedrooms. I need that picture in my mind. And so there's an aspect where children, even if we can mitigate the reading and the math gaps with the right, say, 5 interventions in schools, we also need to mitigate the experience of being kept trapped in your room as a 5-year-old isolated behind a baby gate. We need to mitigate the story that Bob tells in his book about 2 amazing young women living in Orange County, where the younger sister was actually identified for gifted and talented, I think. She had amazing promise, and she tried to get on the volleyball team in high school and was denied because her grades weren't good enough. She tried to get into the gifted and talented program and was denied. She was placed in a program for native Spanish speakers despite her not speaking Spanish because she was Hispanic. And she spent a year not learning anything because she didn't speak Spanish, and so she didn't understand the language of instruction. Right? We have to mitigate the experiences of a girl in Philadelphia who Bob describes, who was in the Greater Philadelphia Youth Orchestra as an 8th grader, who had also been identified as academically talented, who had also had support systems around her, and then her family collapsed. And the neighborhood collapses, and with that, support structures collapse. And I think about some of my students who were working really hard and who were really smart, and who then say when a parent was taken away to prison, or when a job was lost, right, they took on child-rearing responsibilities, right, for their siblings, for their cousins, for their half-siblings, for the stream of kids who came through their homes whom they felt responsible for. And I have some former students who are still doing that in their 20s and in their 30s, who may have graduated from college even, and really done remarkably well, right? Outpaced every expectation that we may have had for them as a statistical matter, and are still now trying to pick up the pieces of caring for families who are in communities that right now are not able to elevate the whole. And that's one thing that I think is really important when we think about how we can help children grow. We need to think about schools, we are a school of education, and all of the other institutions which educate and which help support the development of kids. And so the last thing that I want to say, actually there are 2 last things. One is Bob didn't talk really about what he thought we could do on stage, but he talks about it in the book. And he basically identifies ways in which government can make a difference, ways in which civil society can make a difference, and even ways in which individuals can make a difference. He talks about the power of mentorship and about, say, serving, whether as a formal or an informal mentor, to young people who are trying, or young adults, young parents, et cetera, who are trying to make their way in the world. And being, say, the college-educated person, the person with the job, the person with the stable home who can provide the model and the assistance and the connections. But also there are ways in which he emphasizes we have to come together collectively. And the way we come together collectively as a society is through our public institutions, right? That is how we are engaged in a process of self-governance. But that self-governance, the self is a communal self. Right? It is all of us together. These are our kids and our communities, whether or not we live there, and that's one thing that we have to be really serious about. There is not right now, say the Iowa caucuses are tonight, right? There is a lot of stuff being talked about in the presidential election right now, and there's even discussions of inequality. But there's not really a serious discussion about how we are going to come together in order to ensure that opportunity is truly spread to all in a way where we don't need to rely on, say, heroic teachers or amazing principals, or even the slow and steady and absolutely necessary but also absolutely not enough work of classroom by classroom, school by school, district by district, but also how we are going to change economically, socially, physically, in terms of physical structures, all of these kinds of things. And the last thing I want to say is when I was talking with somebody about Bob's book, he said, oh, it's a really wonderful descriptive piece of work. Who knows if it's true, but it's really great. And I want to draw a contrast. This is sort of me with my ed professor hat on. One of the things that Roland talked about really compellingly was taking some observational data and looking at some correlations and then trying it out in an experiment. And what Bob talks about is all observational. It's scissor chart after scissor chart after scissor chart that is striking in the extreme. But he points out we don't have time to do the experiments to make sure that his predictions are right, because that evidence is only going to come 20 or 30 years down the line when the young people and their families who he is looking at themselves have children and grandchildren, and then we see. So we have to take action now. And some of that action needs to be experiments. And some of that action needs to be trying out lots of different things where we are committed to making a difference. And that I want to applaud both of my co-panelists for realizing it takes a huge range of kinds of research and then kinds of action in civil society, government, and as individuals, and as researchers ourselves, to try to make a difference to make the world a better place for all children.
Great. Well, thank you to our two commentators and to you again, Bob. We've got a short time for discussion up here on the panel. I want to raise, because again, we're in a school of education, I want to raise a school-related question. And then second question, I want to talk about the public discourse and where we are at advancing this as a policy priority. But to start with schools, all of you have acknowledged, and some pointed to in one way or another, the profound differences in the experiences of what Bob referred to in the bottom third, high school educated or no more than high school poor children versus affluent privileged children. So acknowledging those differences, recognizing that we still at best have a one-size-fits-all school system where we essentially give the same treatment to all children at best, and there's a kind of factory model assumption that the material is roughly the same coming in. We give it a high-quality process going through, and when we get out the other side, we can have a meritocracy, despite evidence that contradicts that in terms of whether it's worked that way. Are we now approaching, or is the logical implication for what you've talked about tonight, thinking about a system that actually differentiates in terms of the goods and services that we need to give to poor children, which would differ from what other children who come by many of these goods and services naturally get, and kind of flip the existing order where the advantaged tend to get more advantaged in our public education systems and the poor less so, do we have the sort of political tolerances? Can we practically think our way through to a solution that actually gives children what they need and takes account some of these vast differences that occur outside of school that you pointed to, Bob?
Well, I'll be brief because I'm not nearly as much of an expert on this on schools. I think the most important factor that accounts for the growing gap in terms of quality of schooling is the increasing segregation, so that increasingly kids are going to school with kids like them, whether that's poor kids are going to school increasingly with other poor kids and rich kids with other rich kids. And if I had a magic wand, I would reverse that trend. And I think that not reverse the idea of having a common experience, but rather reverse the idea that we're treating. We currently give rich kids and poor kids a very different experience, and we all know that would work. We know because we know from the Charlotte-Mecklenburg school district where they mixed kids, whether there was within a district. SES, socioeconomic mixing, it worked, and we know that the school board that instituted that got thrown out at the next election. So short of that, and short of doing much more serious work on actually desegregating our society in terms of where we live, I think the only thing I said in the book, you could move the parents by having less segregated residential setting, or you could move the kids by essentially by busing or some kind of having the kids go to school outside of their own district, outside of their own neighborhood, or you could move the money. And I think the first two things would be more effective, but I think that moving money means you have to, if Mary Sue is going to have the same experience as Miriam, given the enormous advantages that Miriam has from outside school, we've got to provide a lot more support, a lot more in-school support for Mary Sue than we do for Miriam.
Well, Roland, you talked about that in terms of time as the first thing on your list, and talking about the 5 days and the 3 days. Can you envision us moving to a system of schooling where we give more time to kids based on where they come from?
I can envision a system where we allow choices that, of which some of those are choices where there's a lot more time. Surely, it's kind of amazing to me that let me just say some facts and then we'll go on to the more speculative stuff. Raj Chetty in his work on social mobility, when he tries to predict social mobility across different commuting zones in the U.S., he actually shows that one of the things that actually predicts social mobility is some of Bob's old work on social capital. But the things that don't predict social mobility are the old way of thinking about education, which are like inputs, per pupil expenditure and those types of things. But one of the things that does predict whether or not you're going to live in an upwardly mobile commuting zone is how high the test scores are there. So I think test scores are important, and I don't think I haven't described any magic. There's no magic. There's no hidden tricks. This is not three-card Monte. You don't need Superman. There are some very concrete policies that one can do to move the needle. And what's amazing to me, though, is that we have this crisis. I'm thrilled that Bob is describing this for all of our children. I'm a little perturbed that, it's been going on for 30 years in America since 1980, since the price of skill went up. It's been going on for 100 years in the black community. My grandmother used to tell me, honey, if you get sick with something, we better hope somebody rich gets sick with it too. And that's kind of what's happened here. But why are we constraining ourselves? There's all sorts of policies that one could envision. There are redesigning collective bargaining agreements so that we have more flexibility around our teaching staff in places that are of dire need. Right? When I go to the hospital and I'm bleeding to death, the last thing I want is someone saying, well, that doctor there has got his hands, his right arm tied behind his back, but he'll make it work. And so I think there are all sorts of things that one can envision. More time is one of them. More choice is another. You mentioned Charlotte-Mecklenburg. Chicago kind of got the opposite results, but I do think that some amount of choice and integration, in particular, Tony Jack's new work on thinking about cultural capital and the importance of that, And success later, I think, is really important. But the key thing to me is to be very frank about it. We've got to decide, and I hope this book is an impetus, that every kid can learn, and that these are all our children, and then we'll try a lot of approaches. Some of them being, school-based, others of them being, the kind of conveyor belt of approaches that the Harlem Children's Zone and others try.
Can I just want to add, Bob, I so want you to have the courage of your convictions to fight for the first two things, to not just to fight for money, but actually to fight for integration, because it is the only thing where we have evidence at scale. We have evidence of individual schools that can function in a highly segregated by race and by class environment and do well. Low-income schools serving, whether low-income white or low-income serving predominantly kids of color. We know that highly segregated, affluent schools serving mostly white kids do well on traditional measures. But we don't have any evidence of a single district that is serving predominantly low-income kids or predominantly low-income kids of color that is serving the vast majority of its kids well. But we do have many evidences of districts that are serving a mixed set of kids well, where kids are still mixed. Now, often you have, mixed districts where they've then separated kids by schools or by classes, and you discuss that in your book. But there are districts that have actually brought kids together, and that is where the evidence exists for if you are poor and you are attending a school that has mostly non-poor kids in it, you are likely to do well. And so I want us to fight for that.
I want to pick up on that because I want to get to the audience, but I want to give sort of a public discourse question here. You mentioned the Iowa caucuses, and Bob, I know you've done a lot of very concerted work to get to leaders to put this issue at the front of the issue attention cycle here.
Right.
And I just wonder, do you think we're at a point where we're generating the necessary urgency to contemplate the kinds of changes we're talking about, just the change Meira just talked about, a huge political capital required to lift that, or a disproportionate investment in the education of poor children, another huge political lift. Where are we, do you think, in terms of developing the sense of urgency and leadership seeing this as a priority in this country?
I've thought actually a lot about that, but I don't know the answer. When my team began this project 5 years ago, our target was we thought we wanted to see if we could make the opportunity gap the primary domestic issue in the presidential elections of 2016. That was our internal target. Mm-hmm. And, from some points of view, we're moving in that direction. In pursuit of that, for my sins, I've spoken with many of the leading presidential candidates this year, and I've talked to lots of people on the Hill in Washington on both sides of the aisle, lots, on both sides of the aisle. But, and that, would be consistent with the idea of we could get a national political consensus on this. It is, in fact, I think, what I call a purple problem. It's not just a problem that you can understand through red lenses or just through blue lenses. You need to have a purple lens to understand the problem and its complexity. But now the political science is going to begin speaking. The more I've hung out in Washington in the last year, the more I've become unbelievably pessimistic about the chances of anything emerging at national level in American politics. This is even before you take into account the likely winners of the Republican caucus tonight. And so I want to change America. I don't think this is a policy wonkery debate. I agree entirely with that. I think this is a political debate. If we wanted as a country to do something about this, we could do it. We know what to do. It's do we really want to fix it? And if you ask most people, do you want to help poor kids have the same chances as your kids have? Actually, if you talk to people individually, they say yes, and they get it. But converting that into political will is a tough problem. I think that's more likely to happen. This is a sad conclusion I've reached over the last year, more likely to happen if we begin at the state and local level than if we begin at the national level. And then we can wait for the national political polarization to somehow disappear, maybe. That's the way it worked the last time. But this is the way it worked in that earlier period. It began, all those reforms of the progressive era began at state and local level, and then were carried, because they worked, they were carried to the national level. And that's the reform coalition I want to build, city by city, county by county, community by community, having impassioned but grounded people try to fix the problem in New Hampshire, or in Boston, or in Seattle, or in Charlotte.
Okay, great.
So can I just add to that? I have to say I have had the great pleasure or great pain of advising two candidates on each on both sides, and not only can I not get them to put it in their policies, I can't get them to calculate the damn effect on people. And I say, this is interesting, but let's calculate the effect this is going to have on people who are lower income or poor. I can't get those calculations, but I really do believe that there are steps forward. Of course, we can't get to all the important issues that Meira mentioned. Of course, when a kid loses a kid to their parents to prison. My father went to prison when I was 12. I get that. It sucks, okay? But we didn't get in this. My grandmother was here. She said, honey, we didn't get in this mess overnight. We're not going to get out of it overnight. And so what I mean is don't mean to sound naive, but you educate some in this generation, and then they become better parents because they're more educated, and that you will start the ball rolling. And I really agree with Bob that the local and city level is the way to start. And the reason we don't have a city that has made fundamental changes for minority students is we don't have a city in America that's done all these 5 incredibly simple things in every school in their city. Like we have a lot of progress to make, and luckily there's a lot of low-hanging fruit.
Good, thank you. Let's open it up to the audience. Meira, if you have a comment on this, but first, if you're approaching, please identify yourself. We're looking for questions, not speeches on this topic, because we don't have much time here, but so please give us your best.
Sure. It might be more of a speech, but so I'm actually from the area. I grew up in Winchester. Got schooled in ping pong actually by one of a colleague of yours. He's really good. And I taught down south, in the rural south, for a number of years, 10 years. Mostly black, low income, 87% free and reduced lunch. And then you come up here and I go to a very well-known educational institution. And it's expensive. It's very expensive. And I go because I'm really interested in, what are how to remediate some of the difficulties you guys have talked about with kids in low-income situations. The first thing I asked the first night by one of the most highly funded, very progressive guy, very well-known, was, now, is everybody in Arkansas missing their front 2 teeth? That's here. Not here in this institution, but here in Boston, with people who look like us, who probably vote for the same candidates we vote for, who live in the same types of neighborhoods that we live in. And he's actually I like this person. But that's what he said to me.
So the question?
The question is, it's actually not a question, it's a statement. That I think if we're serious about it, it is political, it is policy, but it's also us. It's the snobbery, it's the smugness, it's the competitiveness, it's our willingness to believe that we are better because of what we've been able to accomplish, largely through luck, but also some work. I wonder where those intersections are, and I don't know if you had any thoughts on that, but I think it's critically important in addition to what you've said, but I also just challenge everybody in the room who has been incredibly lucky to be able to be here, to be one of those people who goes out and we can integrate right now by what we do. So I don't know if you have any thoughts or comments, but I don't.
Thank you. Okay, we'll have that stand as a comment. We have another questioner over here.
Yeah, at the end of the book, you gave short shrift to Emerson's concept of self-reliance. Emerson's contemporary Thoreau actually practiced a life of voluntary poverty. So I'm wondering whether he also spoke of the degraded rich as well as the degraded poor. So I'm wondering, whether or not you can have upward mobility in the Thoreauvian sense with a lower material standard of living, both for spiritual reasons as well as now for environmental reasons, because we're in an environmental situation now which is much different than those other economic areas of the past that you referred to. So, I mean, poverty itself is a relative question, and it's the values that you're promoting through affluence. Affluence is a double-edged sword. You're going to have to kind of get an idea of where you what type of values you want to impart to these students, whether it's upward mobility or whether it's a higher material standard of living.
Well, I want to have a society in which how well you do in life depends upon your own skills and talents and hard work, and not on what your parents did or didn't do. And that would be true regardless of whether we imagined we're in a zero growth era because of environmental constraints or not. I'm focused on making your success in life depend upon what you do and not on what your parents did or didn't do.
Okay, let's go over here. John.
Hi, everyone. My name is Zan Okudo Lim. I'm a master's student in the Education Policy and Management program here at the Education School. I have two questions. The first question is, for many of us who care about policy and policy implementation, I want to push further on the point, Professor Fry, you brought up courage, having courage. Professor Putnam, you talked about in Charlotte Mecklenburg, the political consequences of decisions that were made. What thoughts, if you could push further on this, what thoughts do you have about how to develop that political will, how to convince voters and convince folks in a democracy to support these changes? How do you think about how to get that to actually happen so we can maybe see some of the same progress that was made, say, during the progressive era 100 years ago? Second question has to do with the timing. I know we've kind of talked about this tonight, but what are your thoughts on balancing that sense for urgency, which all of you have discussed, with the fact that at times with larger changes it might take more time to develop these things? At a previous Askwith Forum, the theme was if you want to go quickly, go by yourself, but if you want to go far, go together. So what are your thoughts on balancing the urgency with the fact that sometimes it takes time to get things done? Thanks.
Okay, panelists?
You want to? Sure. It's not like the Houston School District just woke up one morning and said, you know what, there's some kids who aren't going to reach their full potential. We should get after this. What happened is that there were a lot of folks in the community who, just as Bob said, started to think, well, maybe if we had economic growth and lower unemployment, I would be better off.
Right.
And so you had really a kind of perfect storm in that the superintendent was kind of in the twilight of his career and really wanted to do something bold. The business community in Houston was really interested in having a workforce with more productive skills because they thought it would benefit them. And you had a series of philanthropists who really wanted to do something special in Houston. And so that was a perfect storm there. But the politics are very difficult. And for us, it was just a lot of basic blocking and tackling. It won't sound like much, but like staying in a Houston hotel room for 30 days straight while you do every breakfast, lunch, and dinner with every person you can imagine to try to garner up the political will to do just a pilot, not even to change whole-scale policy. In terms of timing, it's a great point about the cost and benefits of urgency. I kind of have mellowed, I will say. If you asked me that 5 years ago, I would have said that kid ain't going to get fourth grade back. Let's go tonight. I still feel like that, but there is a delicate balance. And so when I do my own work, for example, I try to create agreements with school districts such that if it's successful, they will scale it and pay for it. And if it's not, then we use private dollars to hedge the risk of innovation. So for example, in Houston, where this was relatively successful, they voted in a tax hike that's going to equal $20 million per year so that all kids who are in schools that are at the bottom, whatever percentile, get kicked into this and they get whatever $1,900 more per kid to do these 5 things. They've done the same thing in Denver and other places. So, but it needs to be more. My biggest frustration with my own work and that of social science generally is, the adoption of best practice. My wife is a cancer researcher, and she wears blackout shades on her computer because when she gets on a plane, she's worried that like someone from Novartis is going to take her ideas. When I get on a plane, I let everyone see my screen. People won't take them. And so I think there's a big question here which we're not getting at, which is underline your point, which is how do we get people to adopt even just the best practices? And I don't know the answer to that.
Thank you. Just a time check. We're at the appointed time. We're going to stretch it 5 minutes here because we have people at the microphone, but I'd ask you all to be brief and economical in your question. Yes, sir.
Hello, my name is Jordan. I'm a junior at the college. It seems that one core issue that's been discussed is gaining the political will and courage to make these differences. But I'm curious about another issue of once we manage to somehow do that, how do we create a sustained difference so that we don't see these same scissor graphs 100 years from now?
Well,
No, go ahead.
gosh, I think that the first task, beginning to narrow them now is such a big task that I'll leave to Miriam and her grandchildren the task of trying to keep them narrowed. Of course, you're right. We've got to try to build in a consensus that will sustain whatever policies we have. But I think this is not going to, we all agree, this is fundamentally not what should we do, because we know a lot of things that could be done. It's can we get Americans to agree with this? And I think that's possible, but I think we shouldn't underestimate how big it is, how big a task that is, because it really does, this is not just plug in the title of the book. We need to make lots of affluent Americans think of Mary Sue as if she were their child. And that's a big task. If we can do that, it'll be great. If we can't do it, all the RCTs in the world are not going to make the difference if we can't try to get Americans once again to think of we share responsibilities for one another. American history is not, always becoming more and more me, me, me. In my lifetime, America has gone through a huge cycle, not all during my lifetime, but during the 20th century. America started at a very selfish period around 1900. We then, for about 2/3 of the 20th century, became much more focused on helping all the people in the country. This is not a matter of right and left. It's a matter of worrying about everybody in the country. And then the last 40 years or so, we become much more focused on ourselves. And I want to try to change that. It's partly a job for religious institutions. It's partly a job for serious political leadership. It may be partly a job for people like us who are preaching from a different podium.
Can I chime in on the political will bit? Because I think this is one place where it really does pay to recognize that there are ways to get involved politically in lots of different places, and we need to get involved politically in lots of different places. So, for example, Roland has quietly but insistently expressed his frustration that Bob is sort of framing this right now in sort of two affluent, presumptively white affluent readers as a way of trying to gain ownership and saying, Black kids have been struggling with this for a long time, but that I think is a really smart political choice on Bob's part, right? Saying, who is it, because of these scissor graphs about, say, civic empowerment, right? Who is it who has some power right now? Let me try to speak to them in ways that might be sort of low-hanging fruit there. While at the same time, right, we need to focus on the horrific consequences of historic and present day institutional, structural, intrapersonal, and interpersonal racism, right? And confront that. And we need to think about what we can do judicially in order to try to address some of this. And we need to think about what we do with local school boards, with local principals, with commissioners at the state level, with what we do with policy, with funding. All of this has to be done. And so although there's this sort of downer of, oh, it's so hard, it's also the case that every one of us can and should and must find some point to get involved. And at no point is that going to solve it, right? Are we going to reach this magic thing? But if we all are involved, then actually together, we could actually make a really profound difference, I think, in a shorter period of time than we imagine.
Last quick question. I'm afraid I have to apologize for those of you who are still in line because panelists will be around for a little bit afterwards, but we only have time to take one more. I apologize.
My name is Ben Saw. I'm a master's student here at the Education School. There was talk of the Iowa caucuses and presidential race. I'm also from South Carolina, and in a few weeks I'll be sending in my absentee ballot in the Democratic presidential primary. And so my question is, there seems to be a real internal debate in the Democratic Party as to what are the kind of leading causes of recent income inequality, growing income inequality and wage stagnation. On the one side, what I'll call the populist Sanders side, it's Wall Street, it's the big banks, 1% have too much political economic power. On the other side, I'll call the centrist third wing. It's, globalization, technological change has led to outsourcing and automation of 20th century jobs. I was wondering, Dr. Putnam, if you agree with that framing, where you fall in the diagnosis, and then what the implications are for policy, depending on which diagnosis is the more leading cause.
Okay.
Help him figure out who to vote for. In a few weeks.
You might be here a while. I'm
Hillary
hungry.
or Bernie?
I'm sorry to say this. I'm not an expert actually on American national economic policy. I have views about that actually that I think it's a little bit of both. I think it's a little bit of the 1% power, political power, the political power of the 1%, and I think to some extent it's driven by other trends that you've talked about. I think the issue of the opportunity gap should be a central issue in our national conversation, the one that will come after we've got a pair of candidates. And I expect that no matter who is nominated on either side, there's going to be a really big choice this year between whether we focus I think one side is going to say this is not such an important issue, we should focus on other stuff. And another side is going to say this opportunity gap is a big deal. And I hope that we all try to encourage the candidates who will seek our vote to focus on how they want to fix this problem, the problem of poor kids in America. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
I had a 20-minute talk. I was pretty good with that.
We appreciate you all being here. This is the critical issue of our time. This education school is dedicated to it. Thank you for your commitment. Thank you to our panelists for joining us.
I thought you